Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle with the kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm that made seasoned space travelers want to hide behind their tentacles. 22 years old, fresh out of the Terran Academy, and absolutely convinced that joining the Galactic Coalition was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. Poor kid had no idea he was about to become the poster boy for why humans shouldn't be allowed to play with the big kids. Nexus Station sprawled before him like a chrome and titanium city floating in the void. Ships from a dozen different species docked at various ports, their crews scuttling around with the practiced efficiency of beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel while humans were still figuring out fire. The air recyclers hummed with that distinctive space station ambience, part mechanical symphony, part barely controlled chaos. "Cadet Morrison, I presume?" The voice dripped with the kind of condescension usually reserved for house pets who had learned a particularly clever trick. Commander Vexlar stood before him, all 6 feet of chitinous authority wrapped in a uniform that probably cost more than Jake's college education. His compound eyes regarded Jake with the enthusiasm of someone examining a particularly underwhelming science project. "Yes, sir. Ready for duty, sir." Jake snapped a salute that would have made his drill instructor proud, if slightly nauseous. How quaint. Vexlar's mandibles clicked in what Jake really hoped was amusement. The humans and their military pageantry. "Tell me, Cadet Morrison, what do you know about waste management?" Jake's smile flickered like a faulty light bulb. "Waste management, sir? Sector 7 needs a new sanitation coordinator. Congratulations, you've just been promoted to the most important job no one wants to talk about at dinner parties." The next 3 hours were a blur of paperwork, orientation videos that were clearly made by the lowest bidder, and increasingly creative ways for various alien species to mispronounce his name. By the time Jake reached Sector 7, armed with a mop that looked like it had seen action in 3 different wars and a cleaning cart that wheezed like an asthmatic bantha, his enthusiasm had dimmed to a more manageable level of cautious optimism. That's when the alarm started. Containment breach in Sectors 4 through 12. All personnel maintain current positions. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Jake looked around, expecting to see the controlled panic of a well-trained emergency response. Instead, he watched as every alien within earshot continued their conversations, finished their meals, and generally acted like someone had just announced that the weather would be slightly cloudier than usual. A purple-skinned technician with too many arms walked past, humming what sounded like elevator music. "Excuse me," Jake called out. "Shouldn't we be doing something about the containment breach?" The technician paused, all 4 arms continuing their respective tasks. "Oh, that old thing? Happens every few days. Nothing to worry about, human thing. Just stay out of the lower levels and you'll be fine." But the announcement said Sectors 4 through 12. We're in Sector 7. Exactly, right in the middle of the fun zone. The technician's laugh sounded like a garbage disposal having an existential crisis. "Don't worry, it'll sort itself out. It always does." As if to punctuate this statement, the distant sound echoed through the station's corridors. Something between a roar and a mechanical grinding noise, followed by what Jake could have sworn was the sound of very large claws scraping against metal. The technician's humming got slightly louder. Jake stood there, mop in hand, and realized that his first day in the galactic community was shaping up to be exactly the kind of adventure he'd hoped for. Just not quite in the way he'd imagined. 3 days into his illustrious career as the galaxy's most overqualified janitor, Jake had developed a theory about Nexus Station. It was run by beings who had mastered space travel but apparently never heard of basic management principles. Case in point, the daily containment breach alarms that everyone treated like background music. Jake was elbow deep in what the maintenance manual euphemistically called organic waste disposal when he heard it again. That same grinding, roaring sound, but closer this time. Much closer. Close enough that he could feel the vibrations through the deck plates. "That would be our little problem child," said a voice behind him that sounded like gravel being mixed in a cement truck. Jake turned to find himself looking up at what could only be described as a rhinoceros that had been hitting the gym religiously for the past century. Grunk stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin that looked like it could stop small arms fire and muscles that suggested he could probably bench press a shuttle. He was holding a mop that looked like a toothpick in his massive hands. Grunk, right? The head janitor? Jake tried not to stare at the alien's impressive bulk. What kind of problem child makes that kind of noise? Grunk's small eyes darted around nervously, which was unsettling coming from someone who looked like he could headbutt his way through a battleship. The kind that management pretends doesn't exist. Been loose in the lower levels for about 6 months now. Started in the research labs, worked its way down to the industrial sectors. And nobody's doing anything about it? Oh, they tried. Sent in 3 security teams, found pieces of 2 of them. The 3rd team filed a report recommending immediate transfer to desk duty and therapy. Grunk's voice dropped to a whisper that could have registered on seismic equipment. Thing is, Jake Human, whatever's down there, it's hunting, smart hunting. Picking off lone personnel, avoiding large groups, learning the station's patterns. Jake felt his stomach do a little flip. How do you know all this? Because I've been tracking it. Maintenance tunnels give you access to everywhere, and janitors see everything everyone else ignores. Grunk glanced around again, then leaned closer. Want to know the really scary part? It's not just killing randomly. It's protecting something, or someone. But before Jake could ask what that meant, a new voice cut through their conversation like a rusty knife through butter. Well, if it isn't the human optimist and our resident gentle giant discussing station folklore. Dr. Kepler materialized from the shadows like she'd been practicing for years. About 40, with the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much of the universe's darker corners, she carried herself with the casual confidence of someone who had given up caring about most things several nervous breakdowns ago. Dr. Kepler, Jake nodded. Grunk was just telling me about the containment breach situation. Situation. She laughed, a sound that could have stripped paint. That's one way to put it. I prefer to call it a bureaucratic clusterfuck of galactic proportions. You've been studying it? Jake asked. Studying implies official sanction and funding. I've been obsessing over it in my spare time while filing reports that mysteriously disappear into the station's administrative black hole. She pulled out a datapad covered in what looked like sensor readings and very creative profanity. Want to know what's really fun? Every sensor reading I've managed to get suggests our little friend down there isn't from around here. And by around here, I mean this dimension. Grunk made a sound that might have been whimpering, if whimpering could register 8.2 on the Richter scale. So let me get this straight, Jake said, his optimism finally showing some healthy cracks. We have an interdimensional predator loose in the station. Management is pretending it doesn't exist and nobody's actually trying to solve the problem. Welcome to galactic civilization, kid, Dr. Kepler said. We've mastered faster than light travel, but we still can't figure out basic problem solving. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go file another report that will be immediately classified and forgotten. As she walked away, Jake looked at Grunk, who was still nervously glancing at the ceiling panels. Grunk, Jake said slowly, want to help me solve a problem that doesn't officially exist? The massive alien's eyes went wide with terror. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. It was a terrifying sight, but definitely a smile. Jake Human, he said. I thought you'd never ask. Jake had always prided himself on being a rational person. Graduated top of his class, commendations for logical thinking, the whole 9 yards, which made his current decision to crawl through the station's maintenance tunnels in pursuit of an interdimensional killing machine seem like the kind of choice that would make his therapist very wealthy. Are you absolutely sure this is a good idea? He whispered to Grunk, who was somehow managing to squeeze his enormous bulk through spaces that seemed geometrically impossible. No, Grunk whispered back, but it's the first interesting thing to happen on this station in years. Also, I may have forgotten to mention that the creature seems particularly active in this section. Jake was about to ask what that meant when the tunnel ahead of them suddenly filled with a sound that his brain categorized as, oh hell, no, mixed with definitely not in the manual. It was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the metal around them, punctuated by what sounded like claws the size of dinner plates scraping against the tunnel walls. Grunk, Jake said very quietly. "Please tell me that's your stomach." "That would be our interdimensional friend," Grunk replied with the tone of someone who had just realized he'd left the stove on at home. "Also, I think we're trapped." Jake looked ahead and behind them. Grunk was right. The creature was approaching from the front, and their only exit was a good 50 feet behind them through a tunnel barely wide enough for Grunk's shoulders. Time for some of that human ingenuity everyone kept talking about. "Okay," Jake said, pulling out his emergency rations. "I'm either about to make first contact or become the galaxy's stupidest appetizer." The growling got louder, and Jake could now see two eyes reflecting in the tunnel's dim lighting. Eyes that were roughly the size of dinner plates and glowing with an unsettling intelligence. Behind them, a shape that his brain kept insisting was too big to fit in the tunnel but was obviously managing it anyway. "Here, boy," Jake said, because apparently his survival instincts had been replaced by whatever subroutine controlled his interactions with his neighbor's golden retriever. "Easy there, big guy." The growling stopped. Jake held up his emergency ration pack. "Want a snack? I know it's not much, but it's supposed to be universally digestible." What happened next would have sent every xenobiologist in the galaxy into a theorizing frenzy. The creature tilted its massive head to one side, exactly like a confused dog. Then it made a sound that was unmistakably a whine. "Oh, you poor thing," Jake said, his fear rapidly being replaced by something that felt dangerously like sympathy. "You're not a monster at all, are you? You're just lost." The creature crept forward, and Jake got his first good look at what had been terrorizing the station. Imagine a wolf bred with a small shuttle and raised on a diet of pure nightmare fuel. It was easily 12 feet long, covered in fur that seemed to absorb light, with claws that could probably open cans or disembowel enemies with equal efficiency. But its eyes, those dinner plate-sized eyes, held an expression Jake recognized immediately. It was the look of a dog who really wanted to be friends but wasn't sure if it was allowed. "It's okay, boy," Jake said, tearing open the ration pack. "What do you say we start over? I'm Jake." The creature sniffed the offered food, then gently took it from Jake's hand with teeth that could have severed his arm without effort. It chewed thoughtfully, swallowed, then did something that made Grunk emit a sound of pure terror. It wagged its tail. Not just a little tail wag. A full-body, enthusiastic, oh boy, a new friend tail wag that sent vibrations through the entire tunnel system. "Well," Jake said, reaching out to pat what he assumed was the creature's head, "aren't you just a big softy? I think I'll call you Fluffy." Fluffy made a sound that could generously be called a purr, if purrs typically registered on seismic equipment. He flopped onto his side in the universal belly rub position, completely blocking the tunnel. "Jake Human," Grunk whispered. "I think you've just adopted the most dangerous creature in known space." "Nah," Jake said, scratching behind what he hoped were Fluffy's ears. "He's just misunderstood." "Aren't you, boy?" "Yes, you are. You're just a good boy who got lost in the big scary space station." Fluffy's purring intensified, and somewhere in the distance, an alarm started going off. Again. "So let me get this straight," Dr. Kepler said, staring at Jake and his new best friend through the reinforced observation window. "You went looking for our interdimensional killing machine, and came back with what appears to be the galaxy's largest therapy dog." Jake was sitting cross-legged next to Fluffy, who had somehow managed to curl up in a ball, despite being the size of a small aircraft. The creature's head was resting in Jake's lap, and he was making contented rumbling sounds that were causing small equipment to vibrate off nearby tables. "He's not a therapy dog," Jake protested. "He's more like a security dog. Watch this." He pointed toward the corner of the room. "Fluffy, what's over there?" Fluffy's head snapped up immediately, his ears pricking forward as he focused on something Jake couldn't see. A low growl started building in his chest, not the confused rumbling from before, but something with real menace behind it. "I don't see anything," Grunk said, pressing his face against the observation window. "Neither do I," Dr. Kepler admitted, "but my sensors are picking up some kind of energy signature. Very faint, but definitely there." That's when the lights flickered. Not a normal power fluctuation flicker, but something else. For just a moment, the corner Fluffy was watching seemed to fill with writhing shadows that moved independently of any light source. Shapes that hurt to look at directly, like someone had taken the concept of darkness and given it malevolent intent. Fluffy was on his feet in an instant, hackles raised, positioning himself between Jake and whatever was in that corner. His growl was now loud enough to trigger emergency protocols in 3 adjacent sectors. "Oh," Dr. Kepler said quietly. "Oh, that's not good." "What are those things?" Jake asked, although he was pretty sure he didn't want to know the answer. "Void whispers," she said, frantically checking her readings. "Parasitic entities from a dimension where physics goes to die. They feed on sentient consciousness, usually by slowly consuming their host's mind while wearing their body like a cheap suit." The shadows were getting thicker, and Jake could swear he was hearing voices. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed his ears and went straight to the part of his brain that handled existential dread. "How long have they been on the station?" Jake asked. "Best guess? About 6 months. Right around the time our friend here showed up." Dr. Kepler gestured at Fluffy, who was now pacing back and forth like a guard dog on high alert. "I don't think that's a coincidence." "You mean Fluffy's been hunting these things?" "More than that. I think he followed them here. Look at the pattern of attacks. Every person who disappeared, every accident in the lower levels, they all match locations where I've detected Void Whisper activity." Jake felt several pieces clicking into place in his head. So when Fluffy was terrorizing the station, he was protecting it. These things are pack hunters, but they're also incredibly patient. They've been slowly infiltrating key personnel, learning our systems, preparing for something big. Dr. Kepler's face went pale as she checked another reading. "Jake, how has Commander Vex-Lar been acting lately?" Jake thought about it. The weird mood swings, the increasingly erratic decisions, the way the commander's compound eyes had started reflecting light differently in the past few weeks. "Oh, crap." The station's communication system crackled to life with Vex-Lar's voice, but there was something wrong with it. The words were right, but underneath them was something else, in a harmony that made Jake's teeth ache. "All personnel report to your designated emergency stations. We are implementing Protocol 7. This is not a drill." "What's Protocol 7? Jake asked. Dr. Kepler and Grunk exchanged looks that could have powered a small fusion reactor with pure terror. "Station self-destruct," Grunk said. "Complete sterilization protocol. Usually reserved for catastrophic contamination events." "But if the Void Whisperers have been infiltrating key personnel for months," Jake started. "Then they're not trying to destroy the station," Dr. Kepler finished. "They're trying to use it. Protocol 7 doesn't just destroy Nexus Station. It opens a direct wormhole to Galactic Command." Fluffy looked at Jake and made a sound that clearly translated to "I told you so," but nobody listens to the dog. "Right," Jake said, standing up and brushing dust off his uniform. "Time to save the galaxy. Again. Fluffy, you ready for some real guard dog work?" Fluffy's tail started wagging, and his expression shifted to something that looked suspiciously like a grin. The thing about humans that most galactic species never quite understood was their complete inability to recognize when they were outmatched. Any reasonable being, faced with interdimensional parasites, a compromised commanding officer, and an imminent station-wide catastrophe, would have found the nearest escape pod and hoped for the best. Jake, however, was apparently not a reasonable being. "Okay, here's the plan," he said, studying a schematic of the station's lower levels, while Fluffy helpfully held down the corner of the printout with one massive paw. "The Void Whispers need some kind of anchor point to maintain their presence in our dimension." "Dr. Kepler, where would they set up something like that?" "Somewhere with massive energy output and minimal supervision," she said, pulling up power distribution charts. "The reactor core would be ideal, but that's heavily monitored. The waste processing plant, however." "Of course it's the waste processing plant," Jake muttered. "Why is it always the waste processing plant?" "Because nobody pays attention to waste management," Grunk said with the tone of someone who had been professionally ignored for years. Also, the processing plant connects to every major system on the station through the maintenance tunnels. Perfect. Fluffy can track the void whispers through scent. I know the maintenance systems better than anyone thanks to my glamorous job assignment. And Grunk, Jake paused, looking at his massive friend. Grunk, please tell me you have some kind of useful skill that doesn't involve janitorial work. Grunk's expression shifted, and for the first time since Jake had met him, the nervous energy disappeared entirely. Jake Human, before I became head of sanitation, I was Sergeant Major Grunk Har of the Corellian Heavy Infantry. 3 tours of duty in the Proxima conflicts, decorated for valor under fire, specialist in close quarters combat, and explosive ordnance disposal. Jake stared at him. You're telling me the galaxy's most overqualified janitor is actually a decorated war hero? Retirement is boring, Grunk said with a shrug that could have caused seismic activity. Janitorial work pays well and comes with excellent benefits. Also, nobody shoots at you. Well, Dr. Kepler said, that's about to change. The next hour was a masterclass in why humans and their pack bonding instincts were considered a dangerous wild card by most galactic civilizations. Jake's plan was equal parts brilliant and completely insane, relying on the kind of improvisation that made military strategists break out in cold sweats. Step 1. Use the maintenance tunnels to bypass the station's compromised security systems. Fluffy's enhanced senses would guide them to the Void Whisper anchor point, while Grunk cleared any obstacles with the kind of enthusiasm that came from years of suppressed military instincts. Step 2. Jake would use his knowledge of the station's waste management systems to create a localized containment field around the anchor point, trapping the Void Whispers in a dimension-locked bubble. Step 3. Hope that none of them died horribly in the process. This is either going to work brilliantly or get us all killed in ways that will require new categories of death certificate. Dr. Kepler observed as they made their way through the maintenance tunnels. Probably both, Jake agreed cheerfully. Fluffy, what do you think, boy? Ready to show these shadow things why interdimensional pack hunters don't mess with space dogs? Fluffy's response was a sound that managed to convey enthusiasm, bloodthirsty anticipation, and unconditional loyalty all at once. His tail was wagging so hard it was creating a minor wind tunnel effect in the cramped space. The tunnels grew colder as they approached the waste processing plant, and Jake could feel something pressing against the edges of his consciousness. Whispers that weren't quite sounds, shadows that moved without light to cast them. The void whispers were getting stronger. There, Fluffy rumbled, pointing with his massive head toward a section of tunnel that looked exactly like every other section, except for the way it made Jake's skin crawl. Right, Jake said, pulling out the improvised containment device he'd cobbled together from spare parts and pure stubbornness. Grunk, you ready to introduce our uninvited guests to some good old-fashioned Corellian hospitality? Grunk's smile was a thing of terrible beauty. Jake Human, it will be my pleasure. What followed was less a battle and more a demonstration of why certain species were considered apex predators in their respective environments. Fluffy moved like liquid death, herding the void whispers with the same instincts that made earth dogs excel at controlling sheep. Grunk fought like a force of nature that had taken anger management classes and decided they were optional. And Jake, working frantically with his containment device, proved that human engineering was at its most dangerous when it was held together with duct tape and desperation. The reactor core's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as they cornered the main concentration of void whispers around their anchor point. The parasites had been using the station's waste processing system to spread throughout the facility, but now they were trapped, compressed into an increasingly small space by Fluffy's relentless pursuit and Grunk's enthusiastic demolition work. Now would be good, Jake Human. Grunk called out, holding what looked like half a void whisper in each hand while the rest of them swarmed around his feet. Almost got it, Jake shouted back, making final adjustments to his device. Fluffy, when this thing activates, you need to get clear. This is going to get weird. Fluffy looked at Jake, then at the seething mass of interdimensional nastiness, then back at Jake. His expression clearly said, I trust you, human friend, but this better work. Jake activated the containment field. Reality hiccuped. When the universe finished rearranging itself, the void whispers were gone, trapped in a pocket dimension that existed solely inside Jake's jerry-rigged device. The anchor point collapsed, the whispers in everyone's head stopped, and somewhere in the command center, Commander Vex-Lar was probably wondering why he felt like he'd just woken up from the galaxy's worst hangover. Well, Dr. Kepler said, surveying the wreckage, that was impressively catastrophic. Also completely impossible according to every law of physics I know. Good thing physics is more like guidelines than actual rules, Jake said, scratching Fluffy behind the ears. Isn't that right, boy? Fluffy's tail wagging registered as a minor earthquake on the station's seismic monitors. 3 weeks later, Jake Morrison found himself in the unprecedented position of being the only human in galactic history to have interdimensional threat mitigation specialist on his official job description. His office, such as it was, had been relocated from the waste management sector to a converted storage bay that could accommodate both his desk and his co-worker's tendency to sprawl across the floor like a furry mountain range. Cadet Morrison, Commander Vex-Lar said, walking into the office with the careful dignity of someone who was still slightly embarrassed about the whole possessed by interdimensional parasites incident. I have your new assignment. Jake looked up from the report he was filing. Form 27B, request for official recognition of non-standard personnel, which was apparently what you had to fill out when your partner technically didn't exist in any known species database. Another containment breach, sir? Not exactly. Vex-Lar set down a datapad with the kind of care usually reserved for live explosives. 3 different stations in the Rigel sector have reported what they're calling unusual atmospheric disturbances. Translated from bureaucratic, that means something is eating our personnel, and we have no idea what it is. Fluffy lifted his head from where he'd been napping in a patch of sunlight, ears perked up with interest. His tail started a slow, measured wag that Jake had learned to recognize as his work mode expression. Sounds like they need some pest control, Jake said, scratching behind Fluffy's ears. What do you think, boy? Ready for another road trip? Fluffy's response was a sound that could have been enthusiasm or possibly mild indigestion, but his tail wagging increased to a tempo that made small objects on Jake's desk dance around. There is one small complication, Vex-Lar continued, his mandibles clicking in what Jake had learned to recognize as barely suppressed amusement. Galactic regulations require all personnel transfers to be accompanied by proper documentation, including, he paused dramatically, pet registration forms. Jake stared at him. Pet registration forms, complete with vaccination records, behavioral assessments, and emergency contact information. Vex-Lar's compound eyes glittered with what was definitely malicious glee. Standard Form 15C, companion animal documentation for interstellar travel. Commander, Jake said slowly, Fluffy once ate 3 void whispers for breakfast and then napped for 6 hours. I'm pretty sure he doesn't need rabies shots. Nevertheless, regulations are regulations. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You humans seem to have a talent for creative paperwork solutions. After Vex-Lar left, Jake stared at the pet registration forms while Fluffy investigated what appeared to be a new scratch behind his ear with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for quantum physics. Well, boy, Jake said. Looks like we're officially a team now. Think you can handle being registered as a domestic companion animal? Fluffy looked at him with an expression that clearly conveyed human friend. I have seen the spaces between dimensions and hunted nightmares that feast on consciousness itself. I think I can handle some paperwork. Dr. Kepler poked her head into the office, carrying what looked like 3 different reports and a cup of coffee that had probably achieved sentience through sheer caffeine concentration. How's the bureaucratic nightmare treating you? She asked. Oh, you know, same as always. I've got to figure out how to list Fluffy's species on his registration form. Any suggestions? I've been thinking about that, she said, settling into the chair across from Jake's desk. Based on my analysis of his physiology and behavior patterns, I think Fluffy's species might be naturally occurring interdimensional shepherds. They follow void-based parasites across dimensional boundaries, keeping them from establishing permanent footholds in populated areas. So he's like a cosmic border collie? Or like a cosmic Great Pyrenees, bred for protecting flocks from predators, independent enough to work without constant supervision, and loyal enough to bond permanently with their chosen pack. She took a sip of her coffee and made a face that suggested it was either too strong or possibly radioactive. The question is, what happens when a species like that encounters humans? Jake looked at Fluffy, who had given up on his ear and was now watching Jake with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was waiting for something interesting to happen. "I think," Jake said, "we get the galaxy's first interdimensional K9 unit." Fluffy's tail started wagging again, and somewhere in the distance, another alarm started going off. But this time, instead of the usual mysterious containment breach alert, it was the communication system announcing an incoming priority message from Galactic Command. "Nexus Station. This is Admiral Zorik. We have reports of unusual phenomena in the Rigel sector and are requesting immediate deployment of your new threat mitigation team. High priority, full authorization, and..." There was a pause. "Please bring the dog." Jake grinned, grabbed his emergency kit, and headed for the door. "Come on, Fluffy. Looks like the galaxy's got another problem that needs solving." Fluffy bounded to his feet with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been told that not only was there going to be a walk, but it was going to be the kind of walk that involved interdimensional travel and probably some light monster hunting. As they headed toward the docking bay, Jake reflected on how his career had gone from waste management to saving the galaxy in the span of a few weeks. It wasn't the adventure he'd expected when he signed up for the Galactic Coalition, but it was definitely the adventure he'd needed. Behind them, Nefer. Dr. Kepler watched them go with the expression of someone who had just realized that the universe's most dangerous problems were now being handled by an optimistic human and his pet interdimensional nightmare hunter. "This," she said to herself, "is either going to be the most effective threat response team in galactic history, or the most entertaining way the universe has ever ended." In the docking bay, Jake was helping Fluffy navigate the shuttle's cramped interior when his communicator buzzed with a message from Grunk. "Jake Human, when you get back, we need to discuss the mess you left in Storage Bay 7. Also, someone filed a noise complaint about Fluffy's snoring. Apparently, it triggered seismic sensors in 3 adjacent sectors." Jake looked at Fluffy, who was somehow managing to curl up in a space that seemed physically impossible for something his size, and was already starting to make the rumbling sounds that passed for his version of sleep. "Don't worry about it, Grunk," Jake replied. "I'll fill out the paperwork when we get back. File it under companion animal, interdimensional guardian, prone to enthusiastic displays of affection and occasional reality-bending snoring." As their shuttle undocked from Nexus Station, heading toward whatever new crisis awaited them in the Rigel sector, Jake couldn't help but smile. He'd joined the Galactic Coalition looking for adventure and found something better: a purpose, a pack, kit, and a best friend who just happened to be the universe's most effective pest control specialist. Behind them, Nexus Station continued its slow rotation against the stars, just a little bit safer than it had been a month ago, thanks to a human rookie and his tail-wagging death machine. The galaxy, Jake thought, was a pretty interesting place after all.